In this video, I will summarize the main points of the article Risk Perception and Social Anthropology, Critique of Cultural Theory. It's an article by Boholm, in which he basically argues that there has been very little practical implementations of cultural theory in practice, and he gives several reasons for why that is and why it pretty much should stay that way. It's quite a dense article. It's pretty conceptual, but once you kind of get behind the conceptualizations and make it a bit more practical, her arguments actually make a lot of sense. So I hope that in this video it will also become clear to you. So what will I discuss? I will first of all discuss what cultural theory is and how it is related to risk perception. And then I will outline the main critiques that ALSA has on the cultural theory. And I've summarized them in 4 points. Critique on the concept of way of life, critique on the group grid model, social dynamics, and operationalizing of the theory. And I will conclude with some words on what should be done instead. So what is cultural theory and how is it related to risk perception? So in our article, she starts by outlining that there has been already a body of knowledge concerning the individual factors that influence risk perception, for instance, dread, for instance, how much we can control the risk, if it's a technical risk or if it's a risk from nature, all those individual settings. But risk scholars recognize that those things cannot just put in, that we cannot just study the individual in isolation, but we have to put the individual in some kind of social context in the social world. And this has led to a body of knowledge, body of research called cultural theory, or the cultural theory of risk. And this theory is mainly based around Mary Douglas's group grid model. So what is the aim of cultural theory? Well, it aims to predict and explain what kinds of people will perceive risks, which potential hazards and how dangerous people perceive those hazards to be. So which hazards and how dangerous are they perceived? And so that is kind of the aim of a theory. And I will start by having a look at the main critique, or the first critique, which is on the basis of the theory, the main explanatory component, and that is the way of life. So social or cultural theory is pretty much a social theory on its own, and it therefore needs some kind of theoretical basis. And for cultural theory, that is a way of life. And way of life consists of 2 components: cultural bias, a shared set of values and beliefs on the one hand, and social relations on the other hand, patterns of interpersonal relations. And these 2 parts are in interaction with each other. They are reciprocal, interacting, and mutually reinforcing. And scholars of cultural theory claim that social relations generate beliefs and values, and that beliefs and values legitimate social relations. And the main critique, and the first critique of ALSA is on this fundamental explanatory concept is that it kind of assumes a two-directional explanation. Because on the one hand, social relations generate beliefs and values, but on the other hand, they are constrained because they beliefs and values legitimate social relations. So that makes the theory very hard to test in real life. It makes it very hard to come up with hypotheses. So already on fundamental level of this basis also has a critique. Moving on to the group grid model, Mary Douglas, her fundamental works. And the group grid model consists of two dimensions, two axes. On the one hand, grid, the y-axis, and group on x-axis. And the group relates to the dimension of the social structure, encompassing the claims a group makes over its members, the boundaries it sets, the rights it grants, and the constraints it imposes. So in simpler terms, it defines how people organize themselves into social groups. And then we have grid on the other hand, and this dimension represents the rules or control mechanisms individuals face in their interactions. It ranges from strong rules, clearly defining space and time, to weak rules where classifications fade, allowing for more freedom in interactions. And within this framework, then 4 typologies or 4 ways of life are described. And that is hierarchy, strong group, strong grid, egalitarianism, strong group, weak grid, fatalism, weak group, strong grid, and individualism, weak group, weak grid. And sometimes in the model also the hermit is placed, which is kind of like a group on its own, which doesn't really fit in any of the other categories. And according to the theory, each group has a different sort of risk perception. And also explains that there are certain flaws with this theory. And the main argument is an argument that can be made for pretty much every theory, and that is that it's a simplification of the real world. It can be very hard to come up with groups, to set the boundaries of these groups, and then also to put people in one of those groups. That can be ambiguous, it can be difficult, and people might be part of different groups according to different circumstances. So it is already pretty ambiguous on how these groups are to be used. And she also gives some examples on why it is problematic to test this theory. And in order to show that, she has showed, she put some examples forward of hypotheses. And the first hypothesis she mentions is that hierarchies should express great concern about behaviors such as demonstrations and civil disobedience because they see these acts as disrespectful to the authority. And that fits very, very well within the typology of the hierarchist. But if we put this, try to test this hypothesis, then what we are trying to prove is already embedded with the evidence itself. So hierarchists are hierarchists because they care about order, about strict groups, strict roles in society. So therefore, makes very much sense that they will react strongly against demonstrations and civil disobedience. But that does not necessarily tell us anything. It doesn't give us any new information, because what is trying to be proven is already being put forward in the evidence itself. So, to give another example about the individualists support self-regulation, especially the freedom of bid and bargain. Very much true, very well fitting with the individualist. But if we went to study on this behavior of the individualists, we would basically come to a conclusion that individualists like individualism, which is not really something that would generate novel science or knowledge. So that is the other main critique against the group grid model of Mary Douglas. So then we are moving on to sociodynamics. So also the scholars of cultural theory, they also recognize that there should be some kind of theory or mechanism that accounts for dynamics within the group grid model. So for instance, people move between the different worldviews, the different groups, and how could that be? And the cultural theories put forward that there is individual choice, and there's also the principle of self-interest maximization. So basically saying that people are rational and they would pick the thing that works best for them, that fits with their world views, and if that world views change, then they might adopt a different way of life. Well, Asa has some critique on this as well, because first of all, she says, like, in order to for us to be able to move within these groups, we need to assume that people are aware of these groups in the first place. And it is not really sensible to think that people would actually contemplate by themselves on which groups they are part of, and if they maybe should switch or not switch. So it is already quite unlikely that people would make a rational decision about it. Second of all, she says there is little anthropological evidence. We don't really see this happening in real life, so it's not very likely. The influence of rationality is probably very unlikely, because our culture, the people we interact with, which, as we talked about before, makes up our way of life, we don't pick those people for the most part by themselves. For the most part, this culture and these social interactions are already established from our birth, where we grew up, and what kind of environment we grew up very much determines our social relations and our cultural biases. And lastly, cultural theory pretty much adheres to the stability hypothesis. And the stability hypothesis is that people would more or less level out on one worldview, so making it less likely that people would switch between worldviews or adopt different worldviews in different settings. So for instance, that somebody might be a hierarchist at work, but an individualist in his spare time. That would be adhering to the mobility hypothesis. So in order to put people in one of the 4 or 5 categories, we have to kind of adapt the stability hypothesis. But we need to acknowledge that there are also good arguments made for the mobility hypothesis. So then the last critique is about operationalizing, putting it more in practical implementations. And first of all, the context dependency of way of life. So if we would want to measure cultural theory, and we already acknowledge that people might move between different worldviews, different ways of life. If we would then ask people questions related to cultural theory and their risk perception, we would not know in which kind of way of life they are adapting at that point. And yeah, maybe depending on the setting, they maybe have a different worldview, a different way of life, which would make it very hard for us to make any practical or any generalizations about how people, how culture is related to risk perception. And then second of all, we have a very basic critique on when conducting social sciences, or like something we need to watch out for. And that is that there is a very, it can be a very large difference between what people say and what people actually do. So even if we go out and conduct interviews and surveys, what people say might not match with what people actually do or feel. And then lastly, in this cultural theory, it is not always crystal clear what kind of analytical target we are researching. So this cultures could take different forms and shapes. We could be talking about culture on a national level. We could be talking about culture of a political party, an organization, or a province. And since this is not so clearly defined, it is very hard to make any generalizations. And then lastly, what should be a good way to study cultural theory then, according to Elsa? And she basically says that we should ask the anthropologists to have a look at it, to do research on the link between culture and race perceptions, because the anthropologists, they research culture from a holistic approach. So they don't take a specific stance, for instance, psychology or economical theory, but they take the culture first, all its factors related to that, and then they could relate that to risk perception, and from that generalizations it could be made to establish the link. So that is basically what she closes with. So to sum it up, what have we talked about? First of all, cultural theory. What is it? Very basically, what is it based upon? It is based upon the group grip model, Mary Douglas. And then we went on to describe different critiques. So there is critique like on the fundamentals of cultural theory, on the way of life. There is critiques on the group grip model itself, social dynamics, and lastly, how should we operationalize the theory? How could we come up with testable hypotheses? Well, as we discussed, that is very hard. And lastly, then what should be done if we want to study this? Well, we should have a look, or we should ask the anthropologists and use their research methods to establish the link between culture and risk perception.